Good morning and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Can I ask everyone in the public gallery to switch off their electronic devices or switch them to silent mode so they do not affect the committee's work. Now, our convener, Jenny Mara, has started her maternity leave, and I'm sure you will all join me in wishing her very well. As Deputy Convener, I'll be convening the meeting until the committee chooses its acting convener under item 1. Can also welcome Lewis MacDonald, who is convener of the Health and Sport Committee, who's joining our committee for its roundtable session this morning. Now, item 1 on our agenda. Yesterday, the Parliament agreed under Rule 12.1a that an acting convener of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee should be chosen for the period 5th of March 2020 to 9th of September 2020. The background to and the procedure for the process are explained in Committee Paper A1. The Parliament has agreed that only members of the Scottish Labour Party are eligible for nomination as convener, and this also applies to choice of acting convener. Now, I understand that Anna Sarwar is the party's nominee for this post, so committee members, do we agree to choose Anna Sarwar as acting convener? Yes. Thank you. I congratulate Anna Sarwar on his appointment and now hand over the chair.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you. Thank you, Liam, and thank you, colleagues. Can I also repeat the best wishes to Jenny, who's led as well, and I hope my colleagues will continue to be as well behaved for me as they were for Jenny as our period in convener, and we wish her all the best with the new arrival. Item 2 is the key audit themes roundtable, leadership and workforce challenges in the NHS. I would like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for coming to the committee's meeting this morning. This is the first in a series of roundtable evidence sessions flowing from the committee's report on key audit themes. The purpose of this session is to hear directly from those with knowledge and experience of the health and social care sector to discuss and explore how these recurring issues could be addressed within the NHS. The evidence session will take place in a roundtable format with the aim of encouraging discussion. As usual, members will ask questions from the participants, but the participants can also ask questions of each other. However, we still want to retain some structure to the discussion, so please indicate to me or the clerks on my left if you would like to contribute. When you speak, your microphone will be activated automatically, so there is no need to touch the machine. The committee paper suggests 2 themes for discussion, with some specific discussion points at paragraphs 1 and 9. We will focus on leadership issues first, and then we will move on to discuss workforce challenges. But first, can I ask MSPs and participants to briefly introduce themselves before we begin? So I'll go first and ask Sarwar, acting convener of the Audit Committee and an MSP from Glasgow. And I'll go right.
My name is Dave Caesar. I am the Deputy Director and Head of Leadership and Talent Management for Scottish Government and Chair of Project Lift.
Liam Kerr, MSP for North East Scotland Region.
Professor June Andrews, an independent consultant on health and social care issues, particularly pertaining to older people.
Alec Neil, MSP for Airdrie and Shaw's, and pertaining to this, former Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing.
Good morning, Angelina Foster, currently Chief Executive of NHS 24.
I'm Lewis Morrison, I'm Chair of BMA Scotland and I'm a consultant geriatrician.
Teresa Fife, Director of RCN Scotland.
Paul Gray, I was the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland, and I think that's why I'm here.
Colin Beattie, MSP for Midlothian North and Musselburgh.
I'm Caroline Gardner, I'm the Auditor General for Scotland.
I'm Willie Coffey, MSP for Kilmarnock and Irvine Valley.
I'm Carol Shepherd. I'm Head of Scotland for a company called Medax Healthcare. Medax Healthcare are a private company. We've been supplying medical professionals and workforce solutions for nearly 30 years now.
I'm Bill Bowman, Member of the Scottish Parliament for the North East of Scotland region.
Donald McCaskill, Chief Executive of Scottish Care. Scottish Care is the representative body of the independent care sector in Scotland.
Lewis MacDonald, MSP North East Scotland. As Liam said, not a member of this committee, but convener of the Parliament's Health and Sport Committee.
Thank you, colleagues. And the 2 members on our left are from the official report, and to my direct left are the 2 clerks for the committee. Can I ask Alec Neil to kick off the session this morning?
Thank you very much indeed, Convener, and congratulations to you on your appointment. It seems to me in this conversation this morning there are two aspects. One are the general issues about leadership as they would apply to any organisation, and then there are the specific challenges in the National Health Service. Can I start off with the generality? First of all, I think we do have a problem in Scotland of finding, particularly in the public sector, the calibre and the number of leaders we need, particularly since devolution. I think prior to devolution, a lot of our talent, leadership talent, actually left Scotland for careers elsewhere. For example, in the civil service, many people went to UK departments based in London, and particularly some high flyers. While we retained some high flyers, we lost a disproportionate number to the civil service in London because opportunities in the Home Office or the Treasury or other UK departments were traditionally seen as better places to go to for career development amongst civil servants. And I think, generally speaking, we haven't completely recovered from that. I think devolution, and as the powers of this Parliament have increased, there has been a trend for more civil servants, more high flyers, more potential and actual leaders to develop their career and stay in Scotland. But I still think there's a seepage out of Scotland because of the attraction of London and what goes on down there. So in the public sector, that's a general problem. It's also, from my own experience in the private sector, a problem as well. Because clearly, if you look at the number of companies headquartered in Scotland, including in the wider health and social care sector, then very few of them are actually headquartered in Scotland. And of course, that headquarters is where you would expect normally in a private company to find the leadership. So I think there is a general problem in Scotland still of attracting, retaining and recruiting, particularly the high-flying leadership people that we need to run our economy and our public services. Specifically in the health service, I think there's a real challenge. We have a relatively big organisation and it has a large number of organisations within it. For example, we have about 22 health boards, we now have 31 IGBs, and we have a whole host of other organisations round about and supporting health and social care in the third sector, in the private sector, and in various other ways, such as the pharmaceutical sector and many other sectors that support the National Health Service. And if you take specifically the organisation of the National Health Service, I think one of the reasons we've had so many challenges is that we have found it difficult to find the number of high-quality leaders and managers that we need to, if you like, staff these organisations. Now, we have some excellent people, and this is in no way an attempt to insult people who are in the jobs, because we do have excellent leaders within the National Health Service and social care in Scotland. But if you look at the number of organisations, and particularly some of the ones that get into trouble, and the reason why we're having this round table is there has been a common theme running through particularly the Section 22 reports from the Auditor General, that governance, poor leadership, poor management has been a theme running through a lot of these organisations, not just the health service, but clearly, because it takes now about 50% of the Scottish Parliament's budget, about 50% of the reports we see relate to health and social care, and therefore it's been particularly highlighted to us. So my first question would be, how do we rise to that challenge? What do we need to do to attract and retain the best people? And sometimes when we do recruit people from elsewhere, sometimes it's Scots returning, it's very difficult to keep them here. And it's not always just about the money. It's about, family connections. It's about the opportunities elsewhere. I mean, in R&D, for example, there are huge opportunities, particularly in the States. If you look at the GPs, opportunities are seen to be primarily in Australia these days amongst young people. So there's a huge world out there that we're competing with. So my question is, how do we get the best into and retain the best in Scotland?
I think there was, in that very long question, Alec, also a question about whether we're organisation structure heavy in Scotland.
Yes.
As well. Does anyone want to kick off on that? I see Donald. We'll start with Donald McCaskill, and then I might come to Professor Gray, seeing as he has most recent experience in terms of leadership of our NHS in Scotland.
I think, with respect, I would probably disagree with the basis of the question. I don't think Scotland is short of exceptional leaders. I don't think we have difficulty in attracting, despite the scale and the extent of, in my sector, the social care sector. But I do think we have a crisis around leadership, particularly in social care, and it has to do with terms and conditions. It has to do with the fact that 70% of our workforce in social care in Scotland is non-statutory, and the nature of that dynamic and relationship is not always healthy. I think we need to, very quickly at this committee meeting, define what we mean by leadership. And you described high flyers, and yes, some of them have flown off, but a lot of them have stayed. But what has not altered is the nature of the nest. And we need to have a very different view of leadership. So for me, leadership starts in the front line. It is the care worker who goes into somebody's house, who is able to exercise autonomy and who is trusted to do that, but we're not enabling that to happen with our systems at the moment. It's the frontline nurse in a care home who is able to exercise her ability or his ability to make decisions on a clinical basis. But we're not enabling that to happen because we remunerate them at an insufficient level. And yes, it is the leadership of a social care organisation at local level, and particularly in an integrated environment, it is the leadership of integrated bodies. So the fact that we have lost so many of our chief officers in the last 2 or 3 years is a matter of some concern. I don't think that's the fault of their ability or their capacity, but it is the fault of the system. And so the process and the legislation which set up integration created a role which is virtually impossible for anybody to undertake. So I with respect, would want to posit a position that in Scotland we have exceptionally capable individuals from frontline to senior management, but we, and that's the collective we in the system, need to enable these individuals to lead rather than to restrict their ability.
Can I thank you for that, Donald, because you've very helpfully emphasised the fact that we want to be solutions focused in terms of our conversations. So you've mentioned pay and conditions. We've also mentioned structural issues. What structural amendments do you think are required to reflect what you've just said?
Thanks. If I take the two primary pieces of legislation with which my sector enacts, one is the public bodies legislation which has created the integrated joint boards, and primarily that's the focus for most care home provision and home care provision. I think that is some of the most progressive legislation that the Parliament has passed. Nobody will disagree with the vision of creating a single pathway for the citizen to be enabled to have continuity of care and support from first point of contact to end of life. But what we've created is a piece of legislation which has not fully appreciated the nature of the dynamic culture change which needed to take place primarily in the two statutory bodies of health and social care. I think we've expected women and men as chief officers to do a virtually impossible job, to be responsible to two masters or mistresses and two systems. We did not appreciate just how difficult it would be to manage that culture, and we did not appreciate the power exercise which is at the heart of the system, whether it's at local authority level or at the NHS. The desire to retain authority, power, influence, and primarily to retain resource. Now, the third and the independent sector are almost the children at the end of the queue in that dynamic, which is pretty perverse considering that the majority of social care in Scotland is delivered by the third or the independent sector. So that's a piece of legislation that could be adjusted and adapted to make it easier for chief officers to exercise. And the other one is self-directed support. So the failure to progress on the most progressive piece of social care legislation in Europe has been clearly down to the lack of leadership, the retention of power, the failure to engage in the culture change that was necessary to embed that progressive legislation. And that clearly lies not at the fault of the independent and third sector, but at the statutory sector of social care at local authority level and the NHS centrally.
Thank you, Dr McCaskill. Professor Gray, do you want to come in? I think you're off the leash, Mr Gray.
Thank you, Convener, and congratulations on your appointment today. I'm going to try and answer some of the questions. I'm not going to try to respond to everything that's been said so far. I'm happy to come back on anything the committee wants to hear from me on. I think the first thing is to emphasise what has been said. Leadership occurs at all levels, and the recognition of that is hugely important. It is not only exercised by chief executives or medical directors or executive nurse directors, it's exercised throughout the system. And I think that's something that we should value. I think in terms of structure, it's important to be clear about what is done at national level, what is done at regional level, what is done at local level, what is done at community level, and what's done at personal level. So 5 levels broadly. And to ask ourselves whether structure is the problem or understanding is the problem. So in other words, would structural change help it to be clearer, national, regional, local, community and personal, or in fact, would improved understanding be the answer to that? I think the third thing in terms of attracting people, we've moved quite substantially in the NHS in Scotland. Pardon me for saying we, but it's a hard habit to break. We've moved substantially in the direction of values-based recruitment. And that has produced, I think, some very good results, has caused us to recruit and appoint somewhat different cadre of people from what we might have done 10, 15, 20 years ago. What needs to happen, if you're again coming to solutions, the values to which we recruit then need to be demonstrated in all of the interactions that take place. So, if I may be bold, if every time something goes wrong and people are transparent about it, the first question that is asked is who is going to be sacked as a result, then what values are we demonstrating? Are we demonstrating the values of willingness to learn, values of acceptance of responsibility, values of accountability and transparency, or are we demonstrating a different value? And I think some of the points that the Auditor General has made around this are well made. So what's seen in practice? The third thing I would say is, let us not be quite so afraid of the prospectus that people might be moved around. That's actually a good thing. If we have one national health service in Scotland, however constructed and distributed, the fact that you make the best use of the leaders you've got in the places where they're most needed is, to me, a good thing, not a bad thing. I think that, Donald has made some very important points about power, the retention thereof and the distribution thereof. Sally Loudon and I co-chaired a review on behalf of the Ministerial Steering Group of Progress in Health and Social Care, and I was certainly very clear that as the accountable officer for the health budget, my job was not to try to hold on to it, but rather to assure myself that it was distributed and used appropriately. And I do think transparency about that and an ability to discuss it openly and fairly is important. And I also will take the liberty of agreeing with Donald that more place ought to be given to the third and independent sector in terms of how decisions are made, because they are absolutely fundamentally critical to this. I think he imputes a level of unrighteousness to the health boards that is maybe a little severe, but on balance, I think there ought to be more scope given to the independent sector to say more, and to the third sector, and to have a more direct contribution. But I think the MSG signed off the report, and I think that pressing progress on that is fundamental to success. I'll stop there, Convener. There's more I could say, but I think I want to make room for others.
Thanks, Professor Gray. We may come back to you. I'm going to take Teresa Fife and then Angelina Foster.
Thank you, Convener. I would agree with the point that was made that there is an impact of devolution on this issue, but I wouldn't suggest it's about high flyers going south of the border. My job is a UK job. I actually am Director of Scotland, but I'm an Executive Director of a UK organisation. So I work across the 4 countries and see the movement in there. Pay is definitely an issue. There is a pay differential between what is paid in England that is not paid in Scotland, and that makes a significant difference for people applying. The other issue is that we do have a tendency, and it has come as a result of devolution, and quite rightly to be proud of what we do in Scotland, but there is a tendency to view that you have to have that knowledge of Scotland to work in Scotland. Now, that has been changed recently. There has been an indication of change, which is good, but there is people who have thought, you know, if I go up, I don't understand the Scottish system, health system in the same way, so they are not seen as transferable leadership skills that might actually be recognised. I think the other thing is the culture, though. So if you, and it's more or less what Donald was saying, if you feel you can raise your head, and many people here know we've been talking a lot about psychological safety and well-being, and we mean that for all levels, not just actually for us, for clinical nurses at different levels, we mean it for all levels. When we're in challenging circumstances, and we are in that in places, how the Scottish Government actually reacts and behaves is as important as how leaders behave. But I think that often it feels like the pressure makes people go into a behaviour that isn't always then the best to demonstrate leadership. And I fully understand that sometimes, because I've been in pressurised situations where it isn't easy to keep that balance, but I think many are seeking to do. I go back to the point, though, about leadership at all levels. An example I want to give. So for us, there is not as much value placed on clinical leaders, I believe, as should be. We find it really hard to recruit to senior charge nurses. If you ask them why, you drop your pay the day you become a senior charge nurse. This is known, but not addressed, because you don't get the extra pay that you would get by doing shift patterns, yet you've taken on a leadership role. And actually, I don't blame then the grade below, who earn more, and sometimes the same, would say, why take that responsibility on for no remuneration? But most people don't, as was said, aren't driven by pay, though pay is important in terms of how you live your life and what you want to do. But most people want to see a value placed. So I welcome the values-based recruitment and the work that's been done. It's early days, it's seeking to do what it's doing, but we have a long way to go with that. That change isn't going to happen overnight. And then there is a perception that the values that are placed or said are not the values that are placed when we're under pressure. And the values placed under pressure is get the job done. And that actually doesn't, in fact, enable leadership to think for solutions or think differently. My final point would be is that I do believe we started off by talking about NHS Scotland. We now have integration of health and social care. So how do we recognise how leaders cross that sector? Do we think the only stable for the NHS is up through the NHS? We have in the past. Do we have to think differently? Because if you are coming through another leadership route and you understand integration of health and social care, could you be a future leader within the other part of the sector? I don't believe that people think it can. I think that they believe there is still a stable that you come through, and that would need to change if we were going to do something differently. Thank you.
A consistent thing that has been said by yourself, Professor Gray, and Dr McCaskill is the word culture.
Yes.
Do you think culture is part of the reason why we have such a high turnover of senior leaders?
I think so. I think it's also, though, it is very tough out there in the system. And I'm just at the process, thank goodness, I've been out on the road a great deal because I believe in doing that. And I meet people from all levels who are just really working hard to do a job. But the issues that they're facing and the challenges they're facing, so I'm trying desperately to remember, Paul, what we called it. There was a programme that was like, you know, I'm going to use the word resilience, though I dislike the word intensely, because what I've heard recently, someone was said to me, well, you need a resilience training because you're not resilient enough to cope. Now, believe me, that's going around Scotland and among some staff levels. But there was a programme that we did some time ago, was like courageous leadership. That's the word I want. Well, do you know, it's not easy to be a courageous leader when the risks that you might want to take, being honest with you, are not risks politicians want to take. So actually being a courageous leader where you are going to be told that's not a risk that we're going to accept politically, And especially, if I'm honest, and I've been in this job long enough to know, don't try and take those risks in the year before an election period. Because, in fact, the public have a different perspective on that. So this is not the time to say to people, be courageous, because no one's going to make a significant change in the year before election. I've gone through 3 elections now in this job, so I understand that now. In my first part, I thought, this is not real. Now I know it is. So we have to think, if there's for me, what's missing here is the political perspective, as well as what Scottish Government, how they react, how politicians react, and how they behave equally influence that culture too.
Angelina Foster.
Thank you, Convener. I think, like Dr McCaskill, I may want to offer a gentle challenge to the basis of Mr Neil's question. And by that I mean I'm not persuaded that we have a straightforward marketplace problem here. My own view, and it's a strong one, is that Scotland's public services offer a real tantalising thing to senior leaders. And incidentally, I use the term public service as distinct from public sector in order to include colleagues in the independent and third sector, both of whom are critical, clearly, in Scotland. But I think our national performance framework in Scotland is envied by public service leaders in other jurisdictions because it is the right thing to do when, as a leader, you put the citizen at the centre of your thinking. And so good leaders are drawn to Scotland when they see that that is the basis of our framework. I'll come back to a slight downside to that in a moment, if I may, Convener. But as well, I think we have a scale in Scotland where, again, from a leadership perspective, when people are in this game to make a difference, then our scale in Scotland is truly one where you can make a difference because of the logistics, the infrastructure. I'm sure I needn't labour that point. Complex tasks can become doable at the scale that is Scotland. And thirdly, at the risk of sounding like a Visit Scotland advert, the quality of life we can offer is a genuine component for many senior prospective leaders. So that's to say I'm not persuaded it's a marketplace thing. What I would observe, though, is that culture is key, as others have said. And I would suggest to the committee that we should be clear and try not to conflate two things or confuse two things. And the two things are these: an apparent insufficiency of individuals putting themselves forward for example, CEO posts in health and care at present. That is one thing, a small number of candidates, one might say. That is, I think, not the same as saying there is not the talent and the capability and the motivation and all the potential that we need in the next tier down. The crucial thing that I would ask the committee to reflect on is this: people have to choose to put themselves into those positions of extreme personal and professional exposure. What would make them choose to do so? One, if the task presented is doable. And two, and this reflects the comments about values-based environments from other colleagues, two, if the environment appears to be values-based. We say correctly in Scotland that we want values-based leaders. That is absolutely correct. If we say that and mean it, we have to offer those prospective leaders a demonstrably values-based environment in which to operate. And I think we all could reflect on whether collectively that's what we're currently offering. My third point, if I may, is to return to the National Performance Framework, which is undoubtedly a strength in our country. The Auditor General and others have made the very powerful observation, and indeed the Scottish Government as well, have observed that what is needed in health and care is reform and therefore systems-based leadership, by which I mean collaborative, that sees the bigger picture, that does not drive narrowly one's own institutional focus, blah, blah. My final observation in relation to the National Performance Framework, excellent though it is, the formal accountability frameworks that are currently used to hold the majority of chief executives to account are not yet sufficiently aligned to the outcomes and the spirit and the reality of the National Performance Framework. So, in solutions-based mode, convener, I think there is a very chunky piece of work for us to do as a community to reflect on how might we better align the formal mechanisms of accountability with the excellent National Performance Framework. And I think were we to do that, then that would bring with it also that more attractive environment where collaborative leadership is visibly valued and rewarded.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Dr. Caesar to come in, then I'm going to turn to Colin Beattie to change the focus slightly in our discussion.
Thank you, convener. Excuse me. So maybe going back to the original question, maybe some assurance for the committee. So given what everyone else has said, just some data, if I may. So through the Project Lift kind of work that we've been doing since June 2018, part of that is an active approach to talent management at all levels. So looking for leadership at all levels, as many have described. And I would offer that nearly 1,500 people have come through that process and have been identified as having high potential. So this, if you like, the supply chain is not the issue. Of that, we are actively managing and supporting leaders to come forward into roles. And I would agree that we need to be doing more about how we support people to get a broader range of experience across public services and across the public sector, so that they have that broad ability and have practiced the very, very difficult art of collaboration. So we underestimate, as many have indicated, just the testiness which true collaboration requires, and the skill set, the exhaustive listening that is required, the empathy that is required, the emotional depth, if I might say, that is required for collaboration. This is not necessarily what has been viewed as traditional leadership skills, and certainly not necessarily as traditional management skills. And again, we run the risk of reducing this conversation and other conversations into something that is it doesn't fit actually our language that we're used to using. So we need to be really thoughtful about how we describe these things. Of that number of people, to give some specifics to Angelina's point, we have at least 17 people that we are aware of that are one step away from a chief exec or a chief officer post in Scotland in our public sector at the moment, of which fewer than 20% would state that their aspiration is to step into a chief exec or a chief officer role. It's not a problem with the pipeline, it's a problem with the environment into which they see they might have to live through and the experience of that. And there are lots of reasons for that. So again, we could very easily rush into solutions mode around that, but I think we need to really take time to understand what contributes to the culture in senior leadership tiers. And I know that that is the intent of this committee. We might not get to the bottom of it in one sitting, just to warn you. It's taken me a couple of years to get underneath it, and it will take longer. And it absolutely links to the intrinsic motivators, as Angelina was saying, about what makes us feel fulfilled at work. Which has, as Mr. Neil has mentioned, we're talking about 50% of the public sector purse, and by definition, many of the workforce that we have in the public sector. This is having a real impact on our health and well-being. If people are not feeling fulfilled at work, if they are not being well led at work, they will go home and will not give the due care and attention to their families or to themselves. We have to pay attention to this as if it was part of our service that we are providing. So this really matters to people, and that's what we hear out in the system. And to give you some quotes from public service leaders, so this is not public sector, public service leaders, they are the one single issue that is raised over and over again is a lack of psychological safety. And again, there are many reasons for that, but psychological safety is a key contributor to feeling valued and feeling able to make a difference in roles. Some of the things that people refer to are being punished for creating change, powerlessness to achieve countercultural change, and talking about kindness but being routinely unkind. These are quotes from public service leaders. So there is the biggest mistake that we might make in a meeting like this might be to leave thinking that this is someone else's job to go and fix. We have a collective responsibility, as do many others, to contribute to a Scotland that we wish to be part of. And it links, I think, absolutely to the National Performance Framework and the aspiration that sits within it. And I think back to the very recent fabulous care review and what it says about 15,000 children in care. Why wouldn't we do it for 400,000 people working in health and social care? About it, and they quote from the care review, "It is clear that Scotland must not aim to fix a broken system, but set a higher collective ambition that enables loving, supportive and nurturing relationships as a basis on which to thrive." That is as true for senior leaders as it is for children in care. And we need to work out how we do that whilst enabling supportive accountability, whilst enabling holistic approaches to risk, as mentioned in the care review, and how we can all contribute to that. Otherwise, we may well continue to see a brain drain to other parts of the world. But we have the opportunity, it is within our grasp. We just need to understand our place within it, in my humble opinion.
Thank you, Dr. Caesar. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Maybe I could just touch on a different aspect of what we've been talking about around this table. The Auditor General herself reported that NHS boards are obviously having difficulty filling posts. Now, we've been looking at governance in the NHS, and specifically, I'll mention Tayside and Highland. Do you think that these highly publicised situations that have arisen in, for example, Tayside and Highland, are contributing as a deterrent to people coming forward and taking up leadership roles and non-executive directors' roles on boards and so forth? Is that a reality?
Professor Andrews, I see, wants to come in.
Thank you. I think the governance question is absolutely at the heart of this, because all the discussion so far there has been about leadership here has been about how you make this business work, if you think about the business as being health and social care. And of course, we have to understand that 80% of what happens, what matters in Scotland, is actually outside of health and social care. Is what happens in communities, neighbours, people looking after themselves, just living their lives. And reflecting on what Theresa Fife said about difficult things being done before elections, and also about kindness, because some of the things that we should be saying about the business are actually unkind. We're talking here as if the people around this table are the managerial board of this business. But in fact, the most important thing that elected representatives can do is to do something about a strategic level of decision-making about what's going to happen in Scotland. Now, of course, my interest, my knowledge base is mainly in care of older people. And older people with dementia. And even when I was working in the NHS as a director of nursing ages ago, we kept seeing this graph with the wedge of older people coming towards the system. And we've got hospitals in Scotland even today where like 92 beds or something like that are people who are delayed discharges because they are old and frail and they're not managing to get out of the business whose management and leadership you're discussing. So in a curious way, we shouldn't be discussing how and when you find people who are prepared to do this unmanageable task. We should be talking about the upstream strategic things that we should be doing to make it that this is not the broken wheel they're keeping to try and turn. No one would want to have any kind of responsibility for this task, because in many ways the task is undoable unless we have some real strategic change. Now, as a nurse, my job is to be kind, but I also rip off sticking plasters. So sometimes it seems unkind what you have to say. So I've got 2 or 3 sticking plasters to think about today. We have a lot of bad reporting in the news just now about a pandemic. if you're on the board of a care home company, a pandemic is one of the things that you think about as a potential damage to your business because of the number of older people it's going to take out of the system. Curiously, ripping off the sticking plaster, in that hospital I'm thinking about that has 92 delayed discharges, a pandemic would be quite useful because then your hospital would work because these people would be taken out of the system. Now that sounds like a horrific thing to say, but it is the case that somehow or other we've put people in the wrong places by not having the kind of strategic views that we should have. And that means politicians who don't want to think about bad things just before the election need to think about putting income tax up even higher in order to pay for more care in care homes, and they need to think about whether or not they reinstate geriatric hospitals. I'm sure you could build a geriatric hospital. They need to think about whether your ambition that everybody has their own room or everybody has their own ensuite, whether we actually start to really think about different ways of looking after people. You can't have your cake and eat it. You can't both have the current levels of public finance and have people in jobs trying to work it and have the policies about ageing that you have. Now, I'm not saying we should go as far as China and have filial responsibility laws and say it's the families that should do it, because rightly the emphasis these days is on supporting carers rather than putting a bigger burden on them. But at what stage do we tell people, because of the way we've organised our politics, you're getting this burden anyway? At what stage are we going to tell the people who are running the hospitals and care services, you're getting this burden anyway? I think that there's, in some of the appalling boardrooms that I might have been in, they say, well, another thing that might be a danger to our business is euthanasia. There comes a point when you're really making a decision between the adverse situations that happen in the lives of both the workers and the people who require health care, and the policy decisions that people are not making about increasing taxes, having new systems, and telling the public that they're on their own. Exit sticking plaster.
Dr. Morrison?
I think to respond to Colin Beattie's question about specific localities and whether or not publicity puts people off, I actually think that the issue here is endemic and widespread, and I think those health boards that have not been subject to publicity are probably thinking to themselves, well, at least it wasn't us. So I'm not absolutely convinced that specific localities become unattractive. I think we've talked a lot already this morning about what is a pervasive culture, and I think trying to get into the reasons for that, as Dave Caesar has said, are beyond our powers in an hour. But my observation, to build on something that Teresa said about essentially people exposing themselves, is that there's been a massive conflation, and it happens all the time, between the difference between leadership and management. Often people assume that when they are put in a leadership position that they are there to manage those that they have been put in charge of. And that's the culture issue for me, particularly in the NHS, which is that management is no longer enabling, that the instructions come down the way from management rather than the help being provided from management by those who actually are under their care. To come back to what colleagues said about the care of the elderly, I think the question for me as well is a really fundamental one, which is, what is it that health and social care services are for? What is the need? And have we got that right? We work in a system at the moment where, to try and tie this together, those that lead and manage are asked to deliver particular things on behalf of health and social care. And we haven't really talked about targets this morning, so I will bring that in there. Are those targets appropriate? Because after the winter we've had, and with the prospect of a coronavirus outbreak, it strikes me that the things that the NHS particularly is being asked to deliver, and which actually those that lead the NHS must deliver on and are accountable for, there's clearly potentially a big mismatch between what it is that health and social care needs are and the targets that leaders are actually asked to deliver on. I actually think that one of the ill wins, if we do have a significant viral outbreak, is that I think it will teach us probably some hard lessons, but it's going to teach us some very, very important things about our services, which we must learn from. It's easy to be a bit catastrophist about what might happen, and none of us has a crystal ball in this room about how this might play out. But I think many of the issues that we're talking about this morning are going to be writ large in the next few weeks and months. And it's absolutely important that we learn from it. I think the final thing I would say, to come back to what Dave has said about identifying and nurturing leadership, is that we need to actually accelerate that work, because too many people at what I would call at middle managerial level find themselves colossally exposed when they're promoted. Coincidentally, actually, we were interviewing for a new charge nurse on Tuesday, and it's at that level, I think, that people are afraid to actually take that next step, because they are afraid of being exposed, because they haven't been trained. There's a lot talked about, are leaders born or are they made? That's simplistic. I think leaders generally are trained. But they have to be given the tools to do their job, and the job that they're asked to do must be doable, and it has to be the one that the public and patients need, not one that is actually dictated in an artificial way. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. I don't want to curtail our discussion, because it's been really, really great. So we've got about 5 minutes more probably on leadership challenges, then we'll move on to workforce challenges more broadly. So I'm going to turn to Bill Bowman, who's going to change the focus slightly around leadership challenges again.
Oh, thank you, Convener. Just before we do change the focus, I was just interested in what Dr. Caesar was saying, because we seem to, and a little bit in what Dr. Morrison was saying, you're talking about the pipeline and people coming through, but I do think a leader, by definition, has to be someone people follow. And you perhaps say that leaders are perhaps born, not made, but I think you have to have something in you to want to lead, and you have to have ambition to want to do that. Now, I don't know if that came through just what you were saying in your group.
If I could respond to that. So, and again, we can't do justice to what is leadership in this session, other maybe than to say that it is highly contextual, and we now understand has to be highly social. So leadership has to mirror the needs of the society in which it's operating, the system in which it's operating. So that's why we see so many different styles of it. And to come back to the specific of your point, of course, motivation, stroke ambition, is a key part of that. And that's why it's one of our 4 domains on our leadership profile that we look for. So it's a very generic leadership profile that we're looking for. It includes ambition, it includes ability, it includes values, and it includes insight, all of which are important. And we have varying degrees of that, all of us. Yes, ambition to make a difference for the service that you lead, for the people that you lead, to serve them, perhaps. The leadership followership is one we can maybe debate at another time. But there is no doubt that what we have learned in undertaking the work around Project Lift, it links to the values-based recruitment point that others have made, is that if you are not doing these roles, so formal leader roles where you manage other people, given all of Lewis's kind of hesitancy around that, they have to have a really strong core component of service, of servant leadership in there. That is what people need now. That is what makes a leader demonstrate leadership often. That is a really fundamental component that's kind of wrapped up in the value statement, but is something that is coming out over and over and over again when we speak to people. So yes, ambition, but there is something about making sure that ambition is pointing in the right direction.
Okay, I think we could discuss it. I still think you could.
One second, sorry, Bill. I think Angelina Foster wanted to come on. Just really, really briefly, please, Angelina Foster, and then I'll come back to Bill for what I think is quite an important question before we turn to the next section.
Thank you. To your question then, I think that part of the material disincentive at the moment for prospective leaders with ambition in Scotland is this. Again, rooted in the observations in the Auditor General's reports and in a number of the Scottish Government's own papers, the current construct is not sustainable within health and care. Current service models require reform. And so the unspoken message to prospective leaders at the moment is that if they could only find some sixth gear to run in with wonderful leadership and ambition, the current construct could somehow, under their helm, and with them at the helm, be rendered sustainable. That is simply absurd. I believe we need collectively to adopt a shared narrative that acknowledges the need for system reform and to define the role of the leader to, yes, do the best under the current construct for our citizens and within constraints and so forth, but at the same time, the core role is to redesign our health and care system in Scotland in a way to render it better for the citizen, ultimately affordable and therefore more sustainable. And that is a hugely attractive job description, so to speak, for our pipeline.
Thank you. I think you had a really brief question about lessons, Bill.
Yes, it was just to wrap up now that, what can, let's say, the NHS learn from related private, independent, third sectors on addressing the leadership challenge it faces?
Anyone want to take that one? Donald?
Very briefly. And Dave has already said this: relationship, communication, engagement, collaboration. And where those are evident, then we see integration working at grassroots, we see leadership working in organisations, and we see that collective shared vision and that determination. But as Dave has already highlighted, those don't come easy. And at the moment, in the third and independent sector and home care, we're stripping out by up to 18% in contracts, commission contracts, learning, training and development budgets. We are not going to build leaders who can talk, who can share, who can listen and who can learn if we don't train them. So that would be our lesson to the statutory service and sectors. Listen, learn, share, collaborate, and dare I say, ask.
So, Professor Gray.
Thank you. I think, Mr. Bowman, your question is what can we learn from elsewhere? I think one of the things I've learned in working not just with within the public sector, but now with the private sector as well, is that leadership is hard everywhere. So there isn't some kind of simple solution that sits out there and if only we used it, everything would be fine. What I've learned, though, from the private sector is that making sure that people are clear about their focus and then not distracting them from it is a good thing. The trouble with the public sector, of course, is that things can change very fast indeed. I think what I've also learned, though, is that a motive that is exclusively based on making a profit doesn't actually motivate people all that much. They need a bigger context. They need something more worthwhile. So whether you call it values or something else, people need something worthwhile to do. And they don't think it's worthwhile, they get bored, they get frustrated, and eventually they become demotivated and go and do something else. I think pretending that the private sector is very bad and the public sector is very good is complete nonsense. I think pretending that, however, the public sector is completely dreadful at everything and the private sector is wonderful at everything is equally polarised nonsense. So I think this willingness to learn from the best that we can everywhere is hugely important. I think the values of the public sector remain hugely important to me, and therefore I want to continue to subscribe to them. However, I also think that if we were a little more straightforward about the fact that there are some things that the private sector does rather well. I've no intentions of trying to generate my own electricity or build my own computers, for example. And you know, we live in that world. Let's take advantage of the best that everybody offers, retain the values that we have, and ensure that we're completely transparent with the public about everything that we're doing. But learning from everywhere is better than learning from nowhere.
Thank you, Professor Gray. Carol Shepherd.
Yeah, thank you. I'll agree with just about every point Paul's made there. So I'm from a private sector company. So we've been in healthcare for about 30 years. And what we will do is we will go in and help find workforce solutions. But going back to the point, as a private company, we have the same challenges with leadership. We also go out and get the experts in to help us with our training, with our development. We've introduced a recent promise-based culture, and that started from the leaders up all the way down. But what we have found and what learnings we have taken from that is if people do not have the time to be able to reflect, to have the conversations that they need to be having with everybody around them, so we're all on the same page, we're all working together and working collaboratively, you find that that learning and that investment stops there. And it has to trickle down to everybody. You can't have it all on one person. One person cannot make or break a board or a business or a company. When I was reading the key points for discussion, and this is my first time attending any of these events, my first thoughts were, in our business, if I was provided with that, and we're like, what are the possible reasons for the high turnover of senior leaders, we'd be pulling together all the extensive exit interviews we have held, we'd be looking at the proactive recruitment efforts we've made. What conversations are we having with these leaders we are trying to attract? Why are they not wanting to come? We'd be gathering all that information together and having that readily available. Now, I apologise if it already is readily available. What we would also be doing is, from my perspective, we have worked with many health boards and trusts, and the biggest challenge we find is the culture and the fear of change. You're coming in as a private company going to tell us how to do our job. We're potentially going to lose our jobs. And it's getting that change that we're there to provide expertise and then ideally move out and you can carry on. I've got an example of that with NHS Lothian, who we work closely with, who engaged with Medax Healthcare for the provision of their temporary staff. Now, they were very clear. We are getting you in to learn from you. Once we have learned, we are going to manage this ourselves and we are going to do this. And that's exactly what happened. They had us in, they extended the contract because they wished to learn another part of the business and they wished to take that element away from a third party. And currently, they are the only board who is managing their own direct engagement for the temporary supply of medical locums, taking away that cost that the third parties would be putting in there. But they've invested in that, they spoke to the experts, and now they are putting that in place. So I think there is learning that can be made both ways, but you're absolutely right. There's all the same problems within private sector as there is within the public sector when it comes to leadership and attracting the best talent.
Thank you, colleagues. That's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I deliberately let that run over time because the contributions were first class, so it probably means we've got slightly less time in the second part. But clearly, every single person that spoke mentioned culture. So I think that's a recurrent theme right across people, no matter which view they have. The stuff around the people, skills, training, around pay and conditions. Less of a conversation about structure, more about understanding of structure. But that's probably more things we can come back and discuss till the end of time.
Quick question.
As long as it's very quick, Alan.
Very quick. One of the key points I think that David made, which I think is like one of the key points that's come out of the conversation, is the number of people in the pipeline who are taking the training almost, I think is what he was saying, but won't take the final step and actually apply for the top jobs, as it were. And the figures he gave, I think, were very worrying indeed. So my question is, why do those people not want to apply for the jobs for which they are being trained?
I'm going to ask you, Dr. Caesar, to resist answering that question just now, and I'll let Willie Coffey introduce the workforce challenges part, and perhaps you can wrap the answer into an answer to Mr. Coffey.
Right, thanks very much, Convener. I wanted to open up the discussion to broader, wider workforce challenges. Carol kind of led us in that direction just a moment ago, but with some trepidation sitting beside the Auditor General here, Convener, a report told us clearly that we do face significant workforce challenges. Now, a quick look this morning, Convener, at NHS Scotland Recruitment's website shows us there's 1,380 vacancies in Scotland at the moment right now. Over half of them are in 4 health boards, Glasgow, Lothian, Grampian and Fife, although the number in Highland is quite high, at over 138. The types of posts that we're looking for, about nearly 500 are nursing and midwifery. and about over 300 GPs and dentists come to about 800 vacancies. So some of the opening questions for our guests are, what's going on in this area? Why are we finding it difficult to recruit and retain? Is it something to do with pay and salary? And it was quite concerning to hear from Teresa earlier that some senior charge nurses don't want to take the job. Is it they're lacking confidence, or they even get paid less than the staff that they're supervising? That we have to explore that a bit more. Is it issues about leadership, or is it issues about location? So I'd like to throw the message open, convener, to get some views from the panellists.
Thank you, Willie Coffey. I've got indication from Professor Andrews, and then I'll come to Teresa Fife.
So hopefully this intervention will be quite brief. On this occasion, I was on the Workforce Commission that was working last year. We spent a lot of time thinking about these things, and it may have felt as if I hadn't answered Colin Beattie's question about what we could learn from those health boards, and what I was trying to say was we've learned that the job is impossible. That's the sort of thing we've learned. And going back to the question from Mr Coffey about why it's difficult to recruit people to these jobs, my answer again would be it's because the job's impossible. And what we really need to be doing is to make a plan for the future where it is possible to do health and social care. And at the moment, we aren't really thinking about what it is we have to do in order to make health and social care work in the future. Now, we know what the population profile is going to be like. We have some idea of what the financial things are that we're going to have available. We have some power to increase or decrease the amount of money that is available. But we also have some mentioning the cultural things, cultural changes to make. And that includes things like to what extent families are responsible for care of their older relatives. An example would be, and again, learning from other parts of the world, as Professor Gray says, in some parts of the world, then what you do is you recruit low-cost, overseas, unskilled workers who live in the house and look after your older relatives. Clearly, there are all sorts of reasons why that's not acceptable here, although we do recruit low-cost, overseas people to work in our public services and in our care homes. So, to be brief, there's a whole range of things that we haven't addressed about what the future shape of the service is and the future of what we're going to do. We rather keep focusing on how we keep this broken wheel turning rather than thinking the big picture, what should it be in the future, to which it will be easy to recruit people because the job looks possible, because the job's been properly costed and it's been outlined what the health and social care services in all 3 sectors or 4 sectors will do and what will be left as a responsibility of the family. And some of them seem really unpalatable because they're not like our culture. Where does housing come into this? Are we going to build multi-generational houses so that I can look after my father in my house? Are we going to build houses so that if he becomes incontinent, we don't have to worry about whether the toilet's upstairs? There's a whole range of things. Apologies to my father, who's perfectly well. That was a hypothetical dad. Thank you.
Teresa Fife.
There's no question at the moment there is actually a significant staffing shortages in nursing in Scotland, and there's a number of variables that are influencing that. Nursing is one of the largest workforce in the NHS in Scotland, and also now within the integrated health and social care space. So it's a significant budget. So I've watched a cycle of investment in nursing, disinvestment in nursing, investment in nursing, disinvestment in nursing. And as a result, it impacts eventually on how many people stay within that profession. The senior charge nurse example I gave you has been a long-standing issue, can't get heard on it, because we're very fixed on the systems we're using. So under the process of where your salary is gained by the shift patterns that you work, means that when we decided, and I was part of that system that did that, we needed senior charge nurses work from Monday to Friday, which was appropriate at the time. We didn't pay attention to that. That meant they got less money. But it's much more about the culture for them. So I've been out on the road and spoken to people who said, I've spent time trying to persuade other grades to go for senior charge nurse posts and say, what's happening here? And it is actually that psychological safety and well-being that's affecting them. It's not just the pay. A lot of them, really love their job that they do, but they don't feel the responsibility and the burden they carry is actually something they can do. One of the things that I've learnt from watching when things go wrong in areas, there are 2 distinct differences. If you're in an area where you live and work where you live, you're part of the community. So you feel responsible for the service in a very different way. I learnt that in Grampian when they went through what they went through. The nurses I spent time with said, it is our hospital. It's my family's hospital. So when they leave, they go home facing family and other people who will be critical of what they do. And I saw that in other areas. Fife, I saw that as well, spent time there when they were challenging. If you're in a bigger, like Glasgow, and I was there last week, most people would live in different places. So even though you would be challenged, you don't have that community, that sense of value of I work up there or I work there that actually impacts upon you. We also have, rightly, require an investment in agency and bank nursing. And we do need that because we'll never ever have a system we don't need to have an agency but we have unsustainable costs rising in agency and bank. Because areas, for example, in Glasgow's last week, they told me they are struggling to recruit. Some of that's because the pension changes came in, and that made a significant difference to the workforce. We didn't see that coming. When it happened, a lot of people retired, so they're the people we'll be after very shortly, because they have actually gone back to work part-time. I was in a meeting yesterday, 2 days ago in Orkney, and in the room, the issue was maternity leave, because they were all young and female, and honest to goodness, whatever was going on up there, they were all going on maternity leave. So that's a significant crash for the system. And the other was, we're retiring in the next year. So I said, retiring, meaning what? We're leaving the system, but we'll come back and work as we'd like to work. And that was unanimous around that table. Now, they were all in the 50 to 55 age group. So we have a drain in Scotland at the moment on that age group who do. They want more flexible working. They want to be able to enjoy what they do. And what bothered me is the message taking on a clinical leadership role or a managerial role was actually too much of a burden. And I don't want to do that. They equally, though, were saying they wanted to see that coming through. So what I would like to see is much more value placed back on clinical leader decision-making, because I believe that balance has gone in some places and not being heard or valued, and feel that it becomes, which I don't like, it becomes a language versus clinical versus management, and I think that's wrong, because management are trying to do their job, and it should be collaboration, as David said, team working, not a them and us. There is still a bit of that culture around, and that's very damaging to how people go forward.
Can I ask a couple of quick follow-ups on that, Teresa? One is, do you think the bank system should be expanded and reformed to be able to make it more flexible for people to work rather than turning to agencies?
I would say the boards have done some excellent work around trying to get bank system that reflects that flexibility personally, and I've seen why people choose to work in bank work. You'll never remove agencies because bank will never cover particular specialisms. You know, you could never have enough for some areas. You'd always have to rely on calling in an agency if you were short. For example, theatres, you know. So they've done national work in Scotland to try and manage the issue of theatres, which I think is the right way. I don't think it's that solution is the answer. I think it is more, if we keep investing and disinvesting, at the moment we're increasing nursing numbers, which is great. But the other day someone said to me, oh, we need to stop that now because that's going to cost more. Because we are a large workforce. So people spend more time thinking, how can we get more out of that workforce by changing that workforce, which doesn't make that workforce feel very valued. It doesn't mean that they don't think there is a place for skill mix, they do, but they actually also understand the expertise, as in those who are those clinical leaders, needs to be valued as well. And they don't feel that at the moment in many places.
Dr. McCaskill.
Undoubtedly the biggest challenge facing the social care sector in Scotland, whoever provides that care, is workforce. So we have major, potentially catastrophic issues around recruitment and retention. So the independent care sector, at 67% of the total social care workforce, is probably reflective of others. So we have 9 out of 10 providers struggling to recruit with vacant posts. Therese has already referenced nursing. 1 in 10 of Scotland's nurses work in the social care sector. We have an average vacancy level of between 25 and 30%, but in some parts of Scotland, particularly the north, that goes up to over 40%. That is simply unsustainable. Now, there are various reasons for these. One is, we're sitting here in Edinburgh. If you look last night at, I'll not mention the newspaper, you will see an advert for a dog walker in Edinburgh paying £17 an hour. You will see alongside it an advert from a very well-performing independent care sector home care provider offering £12 an hour, which is still more than the average of the Scottish living wage of £9.40 an hour. We cannot delude ourselves any longer that in Scotland we are trying to purchase care on the cheap. There is no other argument for the way in which we are commissioning social care services. When the UKHCA have evidenced independently that the rate should be around £21 plus an hour for quality commissioned home care, we still have parts of Scotland where a provider in the charitable and the independent sector is being paid £15.45. We are deluding ourselves if we think it's possible to recruit and retain the best if we are quite frankly paying them peanuts. So that's one factor. Another factor, and I would commend the work of Professor David from Stirling University, who submitted to the Health and Sport Committee, David Bell, thank you, who has analysed in real depth, probably for the first time in Scotland, some of the social care gaps. He makes reference to the fact that the National Statistical Body has highlighted our lack of social care data. He's argued that we will need around 20,000 more social care staff in the next 10 years. And he's argued that we will need to triple the amount that we spend in terms of social care provision. A very thorough piece of work. But we're deluding ourselves if we think that we can continue to keep the system going at the present rate. Most of the workforce are female, 86%, and the majority are over the age of 45, and the majority are choosing to leave the sector. There are other additional elements. We are over-regulated. The process of registration and qualification is driving particularly experienced women over 50 out of the care sector, and we have been inflexible in the adoption of new registration criteria. We need to take seriously the fact that from the end of this year, the proposals of the Westminster administration will massively impact our ability to recruit individuals from outside Scotland. We are massively dependent in social care on our international workforce. The immigration proposals will be cataclysmic because they will shut that door. And I could go on, but we must be starting to be honest that this is a whole system. And if social care disintegrates, as it might very well do if we cannot recruit, then the NHS will follow next week.
Dr. McCaskill, I've got Dr. Morrison, Dr. Caesar, and then Paul Gray.
In many ways, actually, what I'm going to say echoes what Dr. McCaskill said. But to come back to the original question, the observations you made about the numbers we are short of, Dr. McCaskill talked about honesty. So a vacancy is only a vacancy if you're looking at the moment. The real question is how many bums are not on the seats. And, you know, consultant vacancies have come out this week, and my colleague Graham Ewanson did some media work around that. We're still not being honest about that. That if you look at the snapshot of vacancies, it's the day after you failed to get any applicants, then that doesn't count as a vacancy. And then in a double whammy, when there's then a response to that kind of message, which is, but Scotland has more doctors / nurses / whatever you like than ever before, you know, I think that's quite demotivating, not just for me as a leader of a professional organisation, but it's demotivating down at individual level to be told, what are you complaining about? There's more of you than ever before. That's not the point. The question is, how many do we need? And how many do we need now? And how many do we need next year? And how many do we need in 5 years and 10 years' time? Now, the holy grail of workforce planning is something that we've never managed to find. And I think one of the difficulties is that I've been through about 4 or 5 different workforce planning processes in my time in medical politics, and to be blunt, none of them, some of them have worked better than others, but none of them has really worked. And the reason is because we're chasing the tail. We're always trying to fix the now. And we're so busy trying to fix the now that it's actually very difficult to plan for the future. The question is okay, why is there a recruitment problem? And money does matter, and compared to the salaries that many social care workers paid, it's very difficult as a doctor to talk about senior doctors' salaries and sound credible, because they are higher, and they are higher for lots of reasons. But we are taxed more in Scotland. Public sector pay policy limits the pay of senior doctors in Scotland. From a personal perspective, there have been years where I had the lowest percentage pay rise in return for my 25-year plus commitment to the service in Scotland. There are some important messages there. People are retiring early because of a tax system which means that they must do. They are retiring early because we've mentioned the burden of regulation, the drip, it's the drip, drip, drip feed of the 500 emails a day. Well, sorry, it's probably more like 50, but you know what I mean, of trying not to drown in your clinical workload and realising that your appraisal and revalidation is a few weeks away and you just haven't had the time to do it. And as I say, the cumulative burden of that. I try not to use anecdotes, but I'm sitting here today wondering when my radio pager is going to go off, because we have 4 junior doctors in my unit, and to date I have 1. And one of the reasons for that is that the recruitment system that was meant to send us 4 GP trainees over the course of this year has sent us 1. And that recruitment system has no responsibility to help us backfill. So that the consequences of the service of the failure to recruit actually impact me as an individual consultant without the powers to fix them. And that's the situation we find ourselves in today. And I will use that anecdote because in a slightly different unit, so I wouldn't be here today, because if the other junior doctor had not turned up today, I would have had to go to work and be my own junior doctor. And that's the situation we're in right now. That the real vacancy rate is actually what is on the ground and happening right now. So unless we're actually open and honest about where we are now, and then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going? You know, what is it that the health and social care services are for? And that requires an honest conversation with government, but it also requires real action, not just to improve pay and conditions, to actually make people feel that they're valued. Carol Shepherd talked about exit interviews. I found myself in the position in my unit 5 years ago where I was the last man standing, where 2 other colleagues had just had enough and left, where they asked a single question about why that was. No, they weren't. They were just allowed to leave. So I think that we are kidding ourselves if we think that we're in a decent position at the moment. To get from where we are to where we need to be, it's not just about complaining about it, it's about actually honestly saying what is it that we need and actually enabling people and giving them the tools to fix the problems they have. Because the problems I've got in my unit today, I have no tools to fix them. Thank you.
Dr. Morrison, can I come back on that? Do you think the service that you have today will be the service you have in 10 years' time? And if not, and you don't know what the service is going to be in 10 years' time, how can you adequately workforce plan now for the future?
I think that's a very good question, and there's probably 2 answers to that. There's what I believe it should be. Now, I'm probably about 10 years away from retiring, hopefully. So, you know, I'm at that stage in my career where I am actually starting to think about the what's after me. And what does the service need? Is it going to need another me? And then actually there's a separate question, which is never mind what I think, is what's going to be available? So there's often a mismatch between what, as professionals, you actually know is required and what you know you might be able to get. I think a lot is talked about service reconfiguration, about, you know, where is it that we're delivering care? And yes, we are changing to care which is not as focused on buildings and is more focused on the individuals who need the care. But we can't pretend that we don't need the buildings and we don't need the beds and we don't need the people. That the answer isn't actually just to pretend that change will make it all better. There's a fundamental question about what is it that we're trying to do.
And a direct question, do you think we currently have a credible workforce plan for the next 10 years?
We haven't got a workforce plan. We've got a plan for a plan, but we've no plan.
Dr. Caesar.
Thank you for that. hospital pass. It would be remiss of me not to mention the Integrated Health and Social Care Workforce Plan at this point, so just to reference that as something that is uniquely challenging actually to produce. I mean, these are we are talking about a highly complex, as Donald has said, interdependent system that actually extends beyond health, social care, however you look at it, if we think about health and well-being. So even just grappling with that, I think is a really important starting point of this. And I think, coming back to Angelina's point about national performance framework, is something that we are uniquely placed to start to put some real investment into considering how we approach these very deep-rooted fundamental questions about what are we there to do, and where are the boundaries, and how can we soften those boundaries to enable us to be more seamless in how citizens are healthy and well, which I do think we have a genuine opportunity to shape in Scotland. Workforce planning is uniquely challenging. There is an absolute commitment to try and make it as good as it can be. And you'll have seen that in the integrated workforce plan, and it won't be perfect because these things can never be. There are many externalities, as one might put it, that will come down the line, and the lag period to medical, nursing, and other healthcare and non-health, directly healthcare related professionals. There is a significant time investment in that. So by definition, it will be really difficult to get that absolutely bang on. But the intent is absolutely there. So coming back to then Mr. Neil's point earlier about why there is a hesitation for people to step into senior roles. Again, these things are complex. Many people have stated that, and when you do what we do quite a lot of, which is trying to broker some of that stepping into, or stepping sort of diagonally so that people are moving up the tree, again, something which we are uniquely placed in Scotland to do, which is actually very difficult to do in England and other places similar in terms of system setup. There are many factors that come into play, many of them have been touched on. Family situation, the team into which they are going to operate, the level of autonomy that they might get, the level of training that might be available, the level of opportunity that might follow on from that, the level of and the experience of accountability that they might experience alongside the scope of responsibility that they may have. So broadly speaking, there is a range of issues based around capability in its broadest sense, both in terms of, as Lewis was kind of saying, you know, what am I actually going to be free to do? What am I actually able to do in this post? Not what does the job description say? And what resources do I have to play, both that I bring but are available for me in my team, in my line manager, in my organisation. And that's really at the heart of what people are experiencing at the moment, which is we talk about workforce numbers as being the thing that we need to fix, and we do, and we need to really understand what we need in place and plan for the future. But we also need to understand what are those workforce numbers doing? What is the burden of work? A lot of that, as many have said, is not necessarily directly related to the delivery of care. It's a lot of it is related to the assurance of the delivery of care, and the defence of how I've delivered that care. And there are a number of different examples of that. So if you like, the infrastructure associated with scrutiny, assurance, accountability, all important things have a level of burden that are felt at every level, right down to the social care provider in an independent organisation, and it's as true in the public sector as well. So we need to understand what is the reality of work for people, and it will be very variable, so there won't be a single answer. And then how does that impact on how we might take a numeric approach to workforce planning? And also, coming back to Angelina's point, what is it that we need to do in this country? And how do we use all the assets in play to deliver a healthy and well nation? And this is something that we need to invest time to consider. We need to invest permission to consider, because at the moment we don't create the space to even get under the surface of this. we are putting, well, we're putting proverbial fingers in the dike and not working out where the water's coming from. So that would be what I would encourage this committee to take forward.
So a new integrated health and social care plan was published in December 2019, a very delayed integrated social care plan. I think we've kind of got a feel from Dr McCaskill and Dr Morrison in particular about whether they think it will address the current concerns. Professor Gray, obviously you're part of drawing those proposals up. Any reflections on whether it will address the current concerns?
I think the fact that folk are trying to do this is something that we ought to recognise. And there is not a clear binary response to your question, Convener. Is the plan perfect? No. Is the fact that it exists good? Yes. Is the fact that it's prompting debate good? Yes. So I think let's try to move to a point where we're seeking agreement on what can be done and not simply discussing what isn't. One of the most important lessons I learned as a leader was something that is 70% good is a lot better than something that doesn't exist at all. So let's try and build on what does exist. Can I make some very brief points? I think the points that have been made about vacancies, Mr Coffey made them, Lewis Morrison referred to them. I think transparency about the vacancy situation is hugely important. A system which has no vacancies is a static system and is therefore likely to be dead. So some are good because it shows that there's turnover, there's flexibility, there's ability to recruit and so on. But the vacancy that you've been trying to fill for 2 years is very different from the one that you've been trying to fill for 2 weeks. And something that shows what's unfillable or apparently impossible to fill seems to me to be important. And the fact is, if you are trying to recruit someone who works in a specialism which is internationally under pressure, the fact that you have a post may be utterly irrelevant, because if there are 10 people who do this and they're all employed somewhere else, there isn't another one to recruit. So we have to think about what type of roles we're advertising. My second point is slightly tangential, but the fact is that in this country in which we live, amongst our lowest paid people are those who look after small children and elderly people. And we've talked about values and culture, so what does that say about our values? I'm not saying money is the only way we express value, but if we are saying that the jobs that are among the least worthy of remuneration are those which involve our most vulnerable people, we are saying something, and I commend to the committee to reflect on that. The third thing I will say is, in this system that we have discussed today, people's lives are being saved and people's well-being is being assured. 3 of my relatives have had their lives saved or greatly enhanced by the health and care system in the last month. So let's not forget that there is a lot that is going on that is absolutely outstanding, because I don't want folk who are working in the system to listen to or read about today's discussion and think this is really completely broken. It's not. There are elements that are not working as they should. There are elements that need improvement. There are elements that need to be ripped up and replaced. I'm not disputing any of that. But there are, I'm not going to try and name professions because I'll doubtless miss one. But there are people working their hearts out this very morning to keep other people alive, and we should commend that. My final question, if I may, is to signal that I would like to ask the Auditor General something, if time permits and you allow. And it's simple. Does she recognise what we've been talking about? In other words, are we talking about a system that, from her perspective, actually is what she is seeing, or are we missing the point?
Auditor General, I'm going to ask you to resist the temptation to answer, because I'm going ask you to wrap up at the end anyway with some reflections, but can I emphasise the point you made about NHS staff? I think that's a point very well made, Professor Gray. Lewis MacDonald, who also chairs the Health and Sport.
Thank you very much. And listen, there's a great deal of interest to what's been said today, and some of it I recognise from evidence taken by the Health and Sport Committee. But this question about workforce planning, I think, is something that continues to be a concern. And along with Paul Gray, I also had a specific question for the Auditor General, which I'm sure she'll be happy to wrap up with her other answers, which is, having commented on the need for effective workforce planning, we've heard it described today as a plan for a plan rather than actually the kind of planning we require. I'd be very interested in her take on it in the short number of weeks she will have had the opportunity to look at that. And also, perhaps from other witnesses, if there are things that they think are required to transform a plan for a plan into an actual and effective workforce plan that allows us to look 5 and 10 years ahead.
Thank you, Lewis MacDonald. Before I take the Auditor General, we are over time, so if anyone desperately wants to make a point in response to Lewis, I'll allow time as long as it's brief. No? Okay. Auditor General, we're going to come to you at the end. You've obviously looked into this in a lot of detail. I understand you've, for obvious reasons, have sat back and listened to some of the contributions today. I think it's been fantastic contributions. Perhaps in your reflections on the contributions you've heard, you can also pick up the direct questions that were posed to you by Paul Gray and Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. I'll do my best, and I'll start by saying I completely agree. I think it's been a fascinating conversation, very rich, very open and honest, to use the words that Dr. Morrison used, and very quickly in response to Paul Gray's question, I think it does reflect what we've been reporting for a number of years and adds that texture and colour and real-life experience to it. So it's been a privilege to be here. Picking up Lewis MacDonald's question, I think we have been clear that workforce planning is complicated, it's difficult, it's not just a numbers game, and needs to take account not just of the professions and the roles that we have now, but the professions and the roles that we will need in future in the context of the changing population that we've got now and the pressures that will bring, as well as the changing expectations that we all have as we move through our lives and the world around us changes. We need to take account of that. And as Angelina said, I think we need to be thinking not just about what the NHS can do, what health and care can do, but what Scotland as a whole can do, the other assets, to use that term, that we can bring to bear on this. Communities, better education, better early years, all the things that the National Performance Framework aims to pull together and to make us healthier individuals through our lives, but also a more resilient society that can support people better in all of that. So it's not easy, and I would agree that the current plan doesn't do enough of what's required yet. Paul's right, there is progress, but it's not helping us say who should we be training and developing for people coming into the workforce now, to keep those nurses and doctors who are deciding the game's not worth the candle or they just can't do it anymore, to make the jobs more doable and to make the system more effective for the longer term. As I was listening to the conversation, I noted a couple of things that I wanted to say at this point, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. Teresa, you were talking about the importance of the political context, the electoral cycle, and I think that's become clearer and clearer to me in my time in this job. I've had the experience where we've produced our annual report on the health service, published on a Thursday morning. I'll be chatting to opposition MSPs in the garden lobby who will say to me very openly, we get what a big problem this is. We know how difficult it is, that it is impossible to close a hospital or to change the way out of our services are provided because of the political pressure that comes on the government of the day. And then I'll tune into First Minister's questions at lunchtime and hear the same people throwing those brickbats at government. Now, I recognise that is a system of the political context we work in, and I think it's something that's important we need to recognise as being a real barrier to the sort of change that we're talking about. I think also the small things that happen, the symbols that people see around the system really matter. So we all know about the things that have happened in NHS Greater Glasgow over the last wee while, in NHS Lothian, within this committee, in NHS Tayside and Highland. The way people are treated by government, by Parliament in those sorts of circumstances, again, have an effect. They go well beyond the handful of people who are named in the papers or sit in front of a committee. And I think that's an important bit of the way this works also. And really, just to finish on a more sort of hopeful note, I think we know that some of these difficult things can be done. We've reported on health repeatedly over the last few years. We've also reported a couple of times on social security. Now, there are some real similarities there, much smaller in scale at the moment, but a system that will affect the lives of the most vulnerable people in Scotland, where a lot of money is being committed to set up a system for the longer term. One of the things we've reported on is how well the government has really lived up to its commitment to prioritising dignity and respect, to designing systems that are different, to involving people in designing those systems, to having various checks and balances to make sure their voices are part of the system. The staff delivering that, both in government, in the programme and in the new agency, working absolutely flat out in some really high-stakes, high-pressured circumstances, delivering IT systems that this committee knows all too well can go badly wrong, but so far doing that very well in a very well risk-managed way. And I do reflect on what we can learn from what was done in that situation for a much bigger, much more long-standing set of public services in health and care, and how we can take some of the great things that have happened there and translate them across to build on the work that people in this room and much more widely are doing every day. Thank you.
Auditor General. Can I repeat the thanks to all the witnesses for the evidence today? I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I think it's been really reflective. I think it's been really honest. All of us, I think, with the same intention to have a health and social care service that is fit for our times and fit for future generations as well. So I want to emphasise the point made by Paul Gray that we have a phenomenal health and social care service that we're very lucky to have. And we want to send our thanks to all our health and social care staff across the country who are doing life-changing and life-saving work every single day. But it's because we appreciate our NHS and love our NHS, we want to make sure that it is sustainable and continues to grow and get better. So thank you to you all, and we'll consider some of the discussions that we've had today in terms of next steps for our committee. I will now close this public session and suspend our session, and we'll come back into private session in 10:42. Thank you.